Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Public Health Ontario Microbiology Rounds presentation on Welcome to the Machine Learning, Leveraging Artificial Intelligence for Stool Parasite Detection. My name is Angela Ma. I'm a clinical microbiologist at Public Health Ontario, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's session. Before we begin, I will mention a few housekeeping items. The chat pod has been disabled to limit any distractions during the presentation, and we encourage attendees to please use the Q&A pod if you have any questions during the session. A discussion and question period will follow the presentation. If at any point during this session you experience any technical issues, please email capacitybuilding@oahpp.ca, and I would likely follow with that I have no conflicts of interest for this session as the moderator. It is my pleasure to introduce the speaker for today's presentation, Dr. Marc Couturier. Dr. Marc Couturier is the Medical Director of Parasitology and Fecal Testing, Infectious Disease, Rapid Testing, and Emerging Public Health Crises at ARUP Laboratories and a Professor of Pathology at the University of Utah School of Medicine. He received his PhD in medical microbiology and immunology with specialty in bacteriology from the University of Alberta and served as a postdoctoral fellow at the Alberta Provincial Laboratory for Public Health prior to completing a medical microbiology fellowship at the University of Utah. Dr. Couturier is interested in parasite diagnostics, enteric diarrheal illnesses, and improving the sensitivity of their diagnoses, in particularly for emerging and underappreciated agents of diarrhea. So without further ado, I would let Dr. Marc Couturier take it away with his presentation.
Thanks, Angela, for the kind introduction. So there's a warning heads up. There's a lot of aspects in this presentation that are meant to be kind of tongue-in-cheeky. So bear with me on some of the images. There's a theme to it. Trying to get these slides going. There we go. All right, so this disclaimer is to be set in the permanent record of the slides. For disclosures, I just want to point out two here. Relevant disclosure for TechSite, which is a company that we've collaborated with for our AI development. And practically speaking, I want the audience to appreciate that artificial intelligence is not really intelligent. It's a bad name. You have to guide the input data and the directions to make AI accomplish a task in a logical, meaningful way. And that's what the images throughout this talk are going to try to hammer home. So the objectives, we're going to describe how we do microscopy for parasite detection currently. We'll review how we apply AI currently in the lab to the permanent stain. And then I'll show you some of the R&D development that we're doing right now for wet mount. So microscopy for parasites is a long-time standard. It's something that has been done since early British naval doctors upwards into modern medicine, but it hasn't changed a lot. So the pros, anything you can see on a slide or a mount, you can identify potentially. And it is fun when you're passionate about it. But there's a lot of cons. It's very insensitive. You have to have really well-trained people. It's very difficult to maintain competence, especially if you have a low positivity. It's very time-consuming. And it burns people out. It's physical fatigue, intellectual fatigue. People are retiring that used to do this on a daily basis. And a lot of our newer trained MLSs don't want to sit on a scope all day. So kind of getting to that point, our standard ONP, as we describe it, as the College of American Pathologists test competency for, includes a wet mount with or without iodine. In generally North America, iodine is often used, but it's not requisite, and a trichrome stain. Some labs, again, feel like it's worth doing a modified acid fast or modified safranin to detect the coccidian parasites and cryptosporidium. Again, that's done just like a trichrome with just different staining. How do we recommend people actually use ONPs, though? You know, in the teaching I do in med school, we always say, okay, first year med students, we're going to teach you this right, and you're going to do it for the rest of your life. 3 or more unique collected specimens per patient over a course of 5 to 7 days. And try to limit it to people who actually have a likelihood of having a parasite. Immunocompromised patients, patients with a travel history that would be relevant, clinically defining the syndrome. Do they have a persistent diarrhea? Do they have a chronic diarrhea? Both would be less likely for viral or bacterial infection. Actually, the way these physicians go out and use it is it basically gets tested on everyone with diarrhea. And then that's a bit of an exaggeration, but our test volumes support that it's not really stewarded that intelligently. So we get about 100,000 O&P orders a year, which means 200,000 preps, permanent and wet mount. And so here's an example of, if I tell AI, show me a physician using tools incorrectly to accomplish a task, this is what it comes up with. I did not specifically say the tool is a lab test. The tool is being incorrectly used on patients, right? I didn't give it that information. So it comes up with something that it just finds from a database. So the way we conventionally do O&Ps, and again, in my lab, we've done a lot of automation because of our volumes. Many laboratories don't have this kind of setup. But we use a special collection tube, which has an integrated filter in it. So we do our concentration through bench scale automation. Then we do the rest of the process, partially manual, partially automated. So we smear the slides manually, but we stain them automated. The wet mounts are done completely manual, and then all that is then viewed on the microscope. What does this look like in my lab? Essentially, we have technologists grab a run of 30. So 30 trichromes, 30 wet mounts. This takes about 2.5 to 3 hours a run. About 98% of these are negative, and all the positives get back read by a second technologist. So if we look at what this actually looks like, it's about 2 to 5 minutes per slide. And that's technologist variables. Some are faster, some are slower. And it's really the questionable negatives that seem to take the most time. An obvious negative is easy, and an obvious positive is easy. It's the ones where you're not quite sure. And so we have concerns about, how much of this work we're having people do. It can cause eye strain, muscular strain in the neck. People just get emotionally burned out. We know the accuracy suffers. Who is the technologist? How experienced are they? Are they tired? Are they distracted by their phone or colleagues talking? Is it morning? Is it afternoon? Is it the first run, their second run, or God forbid, their third run? And how many specimens on their run had low burdens of parasites? In other words, did they find something that they can't find much more? And they're biasing their own perceptions the more they look at the slide. So again, example of AI fail here on the right. The prompt was a microscope hurting a medical technologist. You can see a hand coming out of the back of the head for no reason. So this is where, when you're generating AI, you've got to give it the right input. So we wanted to look at this entire O&P process. Can we make this more efficient and accurate? And this was proposed to me, and I was honestly a naysayer at first. I didn't think this was going to be possible. But I said, I'll agree. Let's do some proof of concept and see if there's any meat here. And so we did that. And the idea with this approach is you're going to digitize your permanent stains and create a stitched together digital version of that slide for an AI model to interpret and give an output of found organisms, basically. And so to get to there, though, we have to have certain things met. It's going to be high resolution, can't be grainy. It's going to be easy to use. And it's going to be as good or better than microscopy. And the scans can't take forever. It's got to be done quickly. So again, an AI prompt of a scanner stitching together a microscope slide. So I'm going to summarize machine learning for a convolutional neural network in a series of very simplified images. This is, very, very oversimplified version of a convolutional neural network. But it should get the point across of what we do to create these AI models. So let's say we want to make something that can find dogs in images. So we want to show it a lot of different dogs. And then the CNN is going to extract features of the dog. Now, we see stuff like ears, nose, tongue, but an AI model sees more like pixel textures and densities. It doesn't really know what these things are. It just recognizes a pattern. So these various classifications, different dogs, are then batched into data sets. And then the idea is you feed more and more examples into it. And eventually you run the model, you refine it, give it more data. You might have to remove some data if it's going the wrong direction for the performance. And essentially you should get to a point where it doesn't just know husky, but it knows variations of husky. The challenge is you can get to a point where husky can be not a husky. And so what we're looking at there is a wolf. Well, you can then take wolf data, define it, teach the model the difference between a wolf and a husky, and then feed it back through your model and create additional classes. And that's going to come back up later when we talk about the wolf we found during development. So I can take that slide and make it lab medicine centric. So the same concept. All of these dogs are now protozoa that you find in the GI tract. And it's the same concept. So we used an approach called supervised learning. Unsupervised learning is when you just feed in data, you don't tell your model anything about it, and you just let it try to find things. We started that approach, it did not work. So a supervised approach, you scan in images, and an expert goes in and basically draws boxes around things that are truth. And they can also draw boxes around things that are garbage, and that's called anti-class. So that's telling the model, when you see this, don't worry about it. So Jess Cohen and Blaine Matheson here did the lion's share of the work on this project for the actual wet lab stuff. Just amazing amount of work. So eventually, your software can see enough examples that it starts to be able to predict the organisms without, excuse me, without someone drawing boxes around it. And then once you start running those iterations, the expert can look at the data and either confirm those boxes that the model finds or say, no, that's wrong. And all that remediation helps the model learn. And you just keep running iterations of the model over and over again on the same data set or on additional data getting fed into the data set, and then keep remediating it. And after about 1,000 remediated image examples of a given organism, the predictions become very accurate. So we did this work for what I'm going to show you on this scanner called the 3D Panoramic 250. So this scanner uses a virtual 80x magnification, and it can load 250 permanent slides at a time. So throughput's fantastic for what we need. It uses an algorithm of imaging called extended focus. And so what that does is at every field that the scanner optic moves to, it captures a Z stack. And then it takes the most in focus image within that stack and assembles it to the next and the next and the next. And you get this mosaic. And I'll show you this later in the demo of how these look. One thing with this scanner, though, for future development, there was going to be an issue. You see this big kind of box sticking out of the front of it. It's at about 40 to 35 degree angle. That's not going to work for web mounts. They're going to drip. So this was kind of a step one to develop permanent stain imaging. We needed something long-term that was going to be better. But to show you why scanners matter, when we started this work, proof of concept, we used a scanner called Modic, which was a lot less expensive, but you can see from the images on the top versus the images on the bottom of 3D Histech, these entamoeba have almost no features on the Modic. They just look like blobs. You can sort of see the nucleus versus down below, the image quality is much better on the 3D Histech. So once we had a scanner, we had most of a model trained. We said, okay, what is this going to do for us? What do we want it to accomplish? We wanted it to be faster, easier, and reduce the amount of work a human has to do in our process. And so the goal when we came out of the gate was, if we can just make it so 70% of our negative slides don't have to be looked at on the microscope, they can just be reviewed in the image analysis, that would be a win. And so this prompt was accomplishing a goal while doing a minimum amount of work. I have no idea why it chose hockey, unless it like cross-reference my browser history that I'm a hockey fan, but there's AI being creepy. So what do we define as success? It's really complicated. If you think about lab tests, we always think about sensitivity, specificity, 2x2 contingency tables. Well, it's hard to really apply those classic metrics to something that's not really a test. So we're developing something that helps us find organisms, but it doesn't generate a final result. It just points you to things. So if we try to do a study and establish the performance, we can't expect, if there's 150 GRE on a slide, that if an AI model detects 148, you say, oh, it missed 2, so that's a 0. Well, a human doesn't find everything on the slide. They find a couple, and they say GRE is there, and they move on. So we instead adopted slide level as our judgment of the performance. So it's the model's capturing a bunch of data and showing it to you. And as long as it agrees with the truth of that slide, we consider that, agreement. And again, on the organism level, it's just not realistic to say if there's 1,000 organisms in the slide, it has to find 1,000. Because if you get to be that specific, you're going to lose sensitivity or vice versa. So you have to decide what you want the model to do for you. And for us, we wanted it to be as sensitive as possible while still being specific enough to not show us garbage, but also not to be so specific that it's going to lose sensitivity. So what does that all look like if we just put that in a graphical format? So if I have perfect specificity, in other words, I never show you something that's wrong, I'm going to have lower sensitivity. And so if this vertical yellow bar represents our performance characteristic of the model, we're never going to miss calling something true, but we're going to miss some stuff that's there. Now, if we slide this performance characteristic the other way, we'll have perfect sensitivity. In other words, we're never going to miss anything that's real, but we're going to see a lot of false positive images. So what we want to do is find a sweet spot where we can fine tune the model to never miss something positive at the expense of show me some junk, because I want to use this as a finder feature. So I'm okay sifting through some junk as long as it doesn't take a lot of time. So taking that all together, I really think about this as, this is not a test. This is an augmentation to a process. And so this model is helping a human be more efficient, more accurate, and not burn out as much. In a way, that's what a multi-channel pipette does. That's what a liquid handler does. It doesn't generate a result, just helps you get to a result with these metrics in mind. So once we locked down the first version of the model and started doing some proof of concept, we challenged it with 120 known positives from our archive. And these were basically holdout. So none of these had ever been used for training the model. So it doesn't know them. And what we found was there were 15 slides where the model found stuff that the original humans had not reported. So in other words, 12% of our positives from our archives have been inaccurately reported. On the contrary, AI missed 2 organisms out of this data set that had been identified by humans. But there were other organisms in that specimen that it did find. And that basically comes out to 0.8% of positive specimens were missed by the AI. So our gain is definitely much more than our loss. So now what about the workflow? Whole slide scanning. This is not really time effective to do an entire slide. It would be about 25 to 30 minutes. And honestly, a technologist doesn't read the entire slide. So we want to determine, can we calculate using mathematical modeling the amount of a slide that the average technologist actually looks at based on fields of view, and then define a scan profile that would only take 4 to 5 minutes and cover the same theoretical area. So we did that, but we needed to see, is it still sensitive? So we took a positive stool with Giardia and blastocystis, and we did a serial dilution in controlled negative stools. And then we took duplicates of these dilutions, we put them through the lab and had people read them without knowing that these were challenge specimens, just ran them through the normal workflow. And then we scanned and read them by AI. And we looked at the analytical sensitivity with this small scan area. And what you can see is the technologist read results by the 1 to 8 dilution, they start to miss the organisms. It picked up again at 1 to 16. They documented it as rare, and then negative for the next 4 dilutions. And you can see the organism count on the AI. It was still detecting as far down as the last dilution. So this calculates to about 4 to 6-fold more sensitive than a human reading a slide manually. So at this point, we felt confident that our scan area, our model performance looked good. It's doing what we were hoping to develop it to do. And so the model then becomes locked down. No further training data or learning is happening. Then we take holdout slide set and we gave them to our commercial partner TechSite, and they validated the final software in-house. Then we took our own validation slide set to validate the process within our laboratory. So all this AI development took probably close to 18 to 24 months, but the actual wet lab validation took less than 2 weeks. Then we trained the lab on the new process of how to use the scanner, how to review the interface, started using it, and no one would have known any different because it's still an OMP. So as part of a validation, we repeated that limit of detection study. And this time we did 4 different dilution sets, different stool dilutions. And then again, same result we saw earlier. None of them were detected by a human below 1 to 16, but the AI detected to 1 to 256. And then this AI prompt here is a robot defeating a medical laboratory scientist. So because lab medicine requires, when you publish, to show a 2x2 contingency table, we did it. And so with our validation set, we had to, again, think about slide level accuracy. So we defined a false positive as the AI is going to show us images that when we look at them, we can't immediately say that's false without having to pull the physical slide to look at it. Because remember, I said we fine-tune this to show us more junk rather than miss anything. And so when we did that, our validation set essentially showed excellent agreement. We had 2 specimens that the AI called positive that the ONP said were negative, and those ended up being false positive AI scans. And then 1 the ONP said was positive that the AI said was negative. So that it brought us to a 98 and 98% agreement between the methods. And then shortly after we went live, we found a wolf. So remember what I was saying, if you don't train something, the AI can't know what it is. It's just going to put it into the closest thing it looks like. So we had a specimen shortly after we went live that was negative for all the intended targets, except in this crop here, where we see the arrow pointing to, there was something there that it wasn't blastocystis, even though blastocystis is a round organism with some small nuclei on the outside. But we knew that that looked a lot like cyclospora. But we don't use trichrome stains to identify cyclospora. But we thought it was interesting that with this, it seems like it's catching it. It just thinks it's blastocystis because it's never been told what cyclospora is. So here's an example side by side. Blastocystis on the left, cyclospora on the right. So what we did was we took a bunch of cyclospora specimens, stained them with trichrome, trained the model, and then created a second version, which now could detect and identify cyclospora. And again, before that, it would have just put everything in blastocystis. With that in mind, we said, okay, look, if we now have cyclospora detection on the trichrome, why don't we try to get crypto and cyclo on the modified acid fast as well? And so the modified acid fast is typically done for cryptosporidium, cyclospora, and cystoisospora. Cyclospora, as anyone who does parasitology knows, doesn't retain trichrome stain. That's why it's not the intended stain. So you'll see ghost forms, which is where they're refractile, but they're not stained. So a human can see this, but it's really hard to key in on. And then cystoisospora, we actually use bright field and UV microscopy in addition to a modified acid fast, kind of for the same reason. The staining isn't always as textbook as I'm showing you here. The UV is actually much easier to do this. So for two reasons, we didn't include this in the first model. One is it's exceedingly rare, so we didn't have enough input data. And two, we really rely on the UV for this. So here's some training data examples for cyclospora. So with a modified acid fast, you still can get ghosts. So we had to teach the AI what a stained oocyst looked like and what a ghost looked like. And then we combined all the data. So in the end, it's identifying them as different things, but it outputs to the user just a cyclospora. And then cryptosporidium, same thing, trained it with thousands and thousands of oocysts. And then again, with our validation summary, I'm fast forwarding a lot of steps here, but it was the same process as the trichrome. We did this evaluation, and essentially what you can see is it doesn't miss anything. What we saw is that basically there's some false positivity with this model, where again, that's okay because we'd rather it never miss and show us a few things that we have to pull a slide to confirm are negative. So, 40 positives that never got to be looked at on the slide because they were obvious, and only 3 of them had to be pulled. So again, we did a limit of detection with the modified acid fast. It was the same process as the trichrome and the same trend. In fact, it was even more dramatic. The same type of dilution series, some technologists didn't even get past the 1-to-1 dilution, whereas the AI went all the way out to 256, and we even carried it to 512 this time. And one of those 3 dilutions made it to 512. Again, we integrated into the lab. No one knew any different. And the analytical process just changed. So I'll show you now, in the last part of this talk, some of our in-process R&D on the wet mount exam. This is a much bigger challenge. So the prompt here is a sneak preview of a stool wet mount slide being shown to a group of pathologists. I have no idea where I went with this. But again, clearly didn't give it enough instruction. So when we get into web mount, we've got some practical challenges. So that scanner I showed you earlier that we worked with, it can't do angles. All right, it does angles, which means it can't do web mounts because things would spill. Also, we have processing time. So web mounts dry quickly, especially when you add iodine. And so if we're looking at 20 to 30 minutes before a slide dries out, that might be difficult to do batch preps. And then web mount, there's Brownian motion, there's flow. And so the more things are moving, the more chance that you could get grainy, like blurry images, grainy images, because the scanner can't focus quick enough. So those are some challenges. So the first challenge was try a different scanner. So we did a lot of development work with the Hamamatsu NanoZoomer 360. Good throughput, horizontal loading, uses a 40x objective, just like we use a web mount on. But we can never get over the fact that it doesn't have a scan algorithm like the 3D Histech. And we had to create a new mounting medium to work with the scan speed. So getting ahead to some of the data we're still generating, we had to abandon the scanner and go to a new scanner that we're just starting to work on. So aside from the mounting media, we also have this depth of focus issue. So this scanner, the Hamamatsu struggle with this is, if we look at a cross view of a wet mount, there's a large depth of liquid in there. And the eggs seemed to be more up toward the cover slip, and the protozoa tended to be down toward the slide. And if this depth is even like 300 microns, a single focal capture is going to miss things. So we need a Z stack of some kind. So our modified mounting media that we made basically just gets around the problem with grainy backgrounds and iodine drying fast. So we basically did a trial and error mixture, different ratios of iodine and glycerol, and came up with something that just made everything nice and crisp and a little bit slower for Brownian motion and flow. So the pictures that I'm going to show you, if this little cell phone's on the right, that was just taken with my cell phone. Or there'll be a scanner image if it was taken with a scanner. So this is Tylomastics, arguably the most difficult organism to detect in a wet mount. And that's really clear for anyone that doesn't know. That's a really easy one to see. Archaeardia looks absolutely amazing. The trophozoite on the left and the cyst on the right. Strongyloides, you can see all the internal features. Trichuris, nice and crisp and refractile. Balantioides, you can see all the cilia, which sometimes you can't see in a wet mount. Now, those were all cell phone images. These are scanner images. This is some of our training data I'm showing you. So Paragonymous at the top, even with confidences of, we only got 4x here, but it's confident that all of those are real. The Strongyloides at the bottom, again, we couldn't train the entire Strongyloides worm because it's too big. So instead we taught it just to recognize the mouth parts. So that's why in all these images, you're seeing the anterior end of the worm. We have hookworm at the top here. We've got Clinorchus, and these numbers showing up in these boxes, these are predictions. So that 0.9999, that's the software saying I'm 99.99% certain this is Clinorchus. And guess what? Most of those are out of focus. And the model is still confident that it's right, and it is right. Some more examples: Anaerobius, Ascaris, including all the different morphologies, the infertile and fertile, they were trained separately. A lot of those are out of focus and blurry, and it's still highly confident in the identification. Here's again Balantioides. Some of these are really dark. Some of them are out of focus. Some of the nucleus looks great. The cilia look great. Cystitis belli, this is the one I said we use UV for, but in this web mount, detected it no problem. Nice and clean, even though they're very heterogeneous in shape. And then schistosoma, this was early training data, so there's no prediction probabilities on this one, but even with these not having a spine in focus, the most recent iteration of this data, it doesn't need to see the spine to identify it. It just knows the essence of schistosoma. So we are in the final stages of development at this point. We ran out of human specimens. Obviously, this takes a lot of unique specimens, takes a lot of example data. And so we eventually turned to getting specimens sent to us from Africa. So this is a nice cooler that came to us over Christmas from a collaborator who was collecting specimens from a village. And that still didn't get us everything we needed. So we turned to animals. Some of these parasites, the eggs look the same in a cow or a goat as they do in a human. So we collected animal stool, did flotations, got the eggs, put them into human stool, and then trained on them. So before we wrap up with Q&A and acknowledgements, when I give this talk, by and large, I can show you the classical research talk that I just gave you. I can show you contingency tables, but the best part is to see what does it actually look like? What is our lab using? And so here's my super secret sneak peek of an AI interface for microscopy being shown to pathologists. So just give me 1 second. I'm just going to bring up a browser. Okay, good. I'm still logged in. So this is our interface for our platform that we've collaborated on development with this company, TechSite. Again, there's other products coming to market. I'm showing you this one simply because this is what we've done to work with. So I told you that this model is going to show me more than I want to see, and that's by design. So what does an average negative read look like? So if I click on this, and again, I've renamed these for educational purposes. Obviously, these would show a specimen accession number, not these type of names. So if I click on the negative, it brings up almost what looks like a thumbnail strip from your cell phone of the images you've taken. And I can look on the left-hand side and see all the different classes that the AI suspects it found. And it shows you the numbers. Essentially, those are very small numbers. And if I click on them, and I can change the size of these, there's all kinds of nice little interface settings you can do. So I can quickly look at these and say, these blastocystis are not real. Scroll down, these Giardia are not real. The Xantamoeba are not real. The white cells aren't real. Maybe one of those red cells is, but when we report red cells, they have to be very numerous. So I would look at that and say, this is a negative. That took me 15 seconds. Now, one of the things that was really interesting when we first brought this in is one of the first days of running it, we had this specimen. So this Giardia was amazing. So again, there's 5 blastocystis that are not real. When we go to the Giardia, these are textbook. For anyone that's ever seen Giardia in their training, I could put this in the textbook and it would look completely like a published image. And the technologists, once they saw this, our process is you pull the slide, you confirm what you see in the AI. They couldn't find it. And that's because if you scroll and look, these are all Giardia, but there's only 18 of them. So in this entire slide scan area, only 18 organisms. So they brought this to my attention and it was, okay, let's use a little trick here. So if I go to this view slide I can bring up essentially like a Google Earth view of the slide, and I can scroll in and out. So if I scroll way out and you see this little box stays there, I can see some features on this. So all I have to do is go on 10x, find this long hair looking thing, or this big trapezoid blue structure. And if I can find that on the slide, I can find this trope to confirm it. And so that's what we do when we have a low prevalence positive. So go back, I'll show you an example. Here is a slide that has blastocystis. These look good. It's got a couple false called giardias, and it's got lots of diadenepa fragilis that are just beautiful. These are nice 2 nuclei, very easy. But again, you'd pull the slide and confirm its presence. There were some false call endolamics, but were actually E. harmani. So we see these little organisms here. These are E. harmani. Again, we pull the slide to confirm them, and then we have massive entamoebas. So these ended up being we call them just as entamoeba, and we confirm the species on the slide, but these ended up being entamoeba coli. And then here's an example of cyclospora on the trichrome. So again, this is that organism that's not supposed to be seen on trichrome. So see how these things all look like refractile ghosts. But the software finds them. In fact, our positivity rate for cyclospora has quadrupled since bringing in AI for trichrome for cyclospora, not for the modified acid fast, which suggests that cyclospora is probably missed by many labs because either physicians don't order the right stains and people aren't trained to detect these in a trichrome. So the way our lab does it is because technically you're not supposed to call cyclospora from a trichrome stain. When we see something like this, we pull the concentrate, do a quick wet mount, put it on the UV, and confirm it by UV. And then in comparison, this is the cyclospora on a modified acid fast. So again, we still have some ghosts, and then we have some stained. So this is what people would be seeing in the lab, both forms. But again, the way that this is the training environment, in the work environment, these are all collapsed just into cyclospora. And then here's our cryptosporidium in the modified acid fast. So again, these 4 to 6 micron little pink spherical objects, and the model caught 225 of them in the scan area. So lots and lots. We did train it to recognize ghosts. These are pretty rare. You see these more with cyclospora than you do with cryptosporidium. So that's essentially, I'm showing you the training environment for the R&D environment, but this looks very similar to what the production environment in the lab uses. And so this is what my lab is using every day. These are the 100,000 specimens in a year. All the stain slides go through this. And then anything that's suspicious or obviously positive, that slide gets pulled and confirmed by a human and then back read by another human. So we have a very good review process where we use AI to find things, 2 humans to verify. And if there's disagreement between the 2 humans, I'm the final call on medical director review. And so in some stages, we have AI and 3 individuals confirming. Interestingly, since we've adopted AI and gone to this process, our positivity rate went from 2.5% to 5.5%. And so I'm certain that in the past, we and every other lab would have been missing things that the AI just helped us find easier. So I will stop with that demo and go back and finish up with the most important slide, which is the acknowledgements. Our R&D group, Blaine Matheson, Katie Knight, and Jess Cohen, who did the largest amount of work on these projects, TechSite, our collaborators, especially John Walker, helped write the paper, the data analysis, worked with us literally on a weekly basis in R&D calls. For a commercial company, it felt more like an academic venture. Our parasitology lab, especially Madison Sant, but the entire lab as a group, and everyone embraced the technology. There was no pushback. There was no, I don't want to do this. This is new. This is difficult. In fact, we have one technologist who's been doing this for 35 years. And I thought he would be the pushback. And he said, the first time the scanner went down for maintenance, and we went back to a manual process for a day, he said, Mark, I never want to do this again. I cannot do this without the AI. It is just so much easier. And so that was pretty telling to me. So with that, I want to thank everyone at Public Health Ontario and Angela, especially for inviting me. It's always a real pleasure to be invited by a former fellow to talk at their institution. It means that you probably didn't completely mess up in your training for them, and they still want to interface with you. Also great to talk back to the labs in Canada. It's been 14 years since I've been up there working, so definitely miss the environment. So thank you very much, and love to answer some questions.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that amazing presentation and a demo as well. That was a great part of it. We're now going to move to the Q&A segment of this event to address some of the questions from our audience. Again, I'd like to remind the audience to please continue to enter your questions into the pod if you have not already done so. So we have a number of questions to go through, so I'm going to try and work our way through them. One of our first questions I'd like to ask you is that, would the trichrome model also be able to detect the helminths, or would those be discarded if seen by the AI due to a lack of training on them?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we know we would not detect them with AI. Part of this, we don't really detect helminths on trichromes routinely. If an egg happens to stick and make it through the staining process, you might see it serendipitously, but often when you smear the stool and then put it through all the wash steps, the eggs often don't make it through that process anyway. That's why we have the wet mount, is to detect that. And that's why we had to do this R&D development for the wet mount component, because in order to do a comprehensive detection, we really need both pieces.
Thank you for that answer. I'm going to combine a couple of more technical questions into one question for you. Firstly, how large, or the number of images, how many were used for the training data set for the model? And kind of together with that is, what are the mountains that you had used so far during your validations on the smear scanners?
Trying to understand the second part about the mountains.
Or is there a specific mounting media that had to be changed from like the manuals setup of smears for the scanner then, would you say?
As far as like, yeah, so for we just actually know where we have xylene and a permanent automated cover slipper that we use. So it uses the tape cover slips, not like glass cover slips. So it's exactly what's used in tissue histology that we're using. So nothing special. We actually, before we did our AI, we never cover slipped any of our trichromes. We always did them without cover slips. So it is xylene based with the tape type cover slip, not a glass cover slip. As far as the training numbers, that's a great question, and that's variable. So blastocystis, we ended up having to use about 58,000 images because that one is so heterogeneous. It is so nondescript that we had to put a lot of good data in and also teach it wrong data to be able to make that one work well. In comparison, Giardia is so unique. It's so constrained. That one we barely had to hit 1,000 before, and that's 1,000 organism images before it was just not really missing anything. So great question. It's variable with the organism. I will tell you, the web mounts, the cysts and trophozoites has taken, like I said, we're still going, but those are in the 20s to 50,000s for some of the small trophozoites. But for the helminth eggs, where they're consistently shaped, consistently sized, we started to get almost perfect recall after 100 organisms.
Thank you so much for that in-depth answer. Another question that we have in our Q&A pod is, have you also considered training a model for blood smears at ARUP and for other specimens such as tissue or body fluids?
Great question. My master's student actually did some blood smear training, and then Nanad Mehta, who was one of our fellows, who's now in Saskatchewan, he worked on that project as well. We tried taking it as a shortcut because it was a master's project and using an existing hematology model, and it surprisingly did not work for malaria, but it worked exquisitely for trypanosomes and microfilaria. It was something with the focus algorithm of that model is it was keying in on the cell membranes of the red cells, and it wasn't focusing deep enough to see the malaria and babesia inside. But for extracellular parasites, it worked really well. We did not pursue it commercially, and that was mainly a business decision because our volumes are so low for those that it made it a hard kind of business case to invest thousands and thousands of dollars in R&D for something we do, 10 or 12 a week. There's also some commercial solutions for that coming out on the market. So it just didn't seem like a great business case, but it was a great master's project.
Awesome. Thanks for that answer. I have a question in the Q&A pod, and it's something that I was also thinking about during your presentation. Do you foresee or have you experienced with the adoption of AI-supported identification leading to a negative impact on technologists' competence for independent ID in the future, or have you seen it in the lab at all?
I actually think it's the other way. Based on our experience, I think what the AI has done, especially the way we trained it to be less specific, is it's forced technologists to be extremely thorough in confirming what they're seeing and correlating it to the AI. So the AI can be wrong, right? That's how we trained it. We trained it to show us more and miss nothing. And so I feel like our technologists now, because it's showing more truth and our positivity rates up, they're reviewing more, they're seeing more, and they're having to use a little bit more of an analytical process to make sure that what they're finally deciding is there is actually there. And that review process that I mentioned, one technologist back right by a second, and then discrepants come to me. The discrepancy rate is probably 5% of the total, if not less. So that tells me that the competency is actually quite high because they don't have to escalate them to me for review that often.
Now, that's great to hear. Another question in our Q&A pod. Does each lab have to do their own AI training, or can this algorithm be available to other diagnostic or clinical labs for implementation and validation? And what are your thoughts on that?
Great question. No, this is available off the shelf as a service from TechSite. Again, I'm not endorsing you could use whatever product you want on the market. But if you decided, I want to look into what Mark was doing, you can contact TechSite and you can access all these models as a fee for service to upload scans to them. The cool thing is that we fed in a lot of data from different scanners and with different stains, different types of stains. So traditional trichrome, eco stain, different fixatives, all the different fixatives. So even if you have variations like that, the model's already kind of smooth for it. And so really you, to a certain extent, can just plug and play for that. So that's kind of nice. You would have to change some stuff like the way you smear your slides to make sure it's in the part of the slide that gets scanned for the upload. And you'd have to cover slip if you weren't cover slipping. So there's modifications to your workflow, but they're not significantly laborious.
Thank you so much for that answer and to answering all the other questions that we've brought up in the Q&A pod for our Q&A session. Because we're coming up to time, we're going to end off our Q&A session here. But I'd just like to thank you so much, for your wonderful presentation at PHO Microbiology Rounds. Thank you to Dr. Mercatoria for the presentation and the demo. And I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us for today's webinar. You can expect a brief and anonymous PHO Microbiology Round survey for today's session, and please try to complete this to help us improve our programming. Lastly, to access past PHO presentations and to view confirmed and upcoming sessions, please visit the PHO website, head to Education and Events, and click on Presentations. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.